Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We're the podcast where we sift through stacks of sources, research notes,
Yeah.
all that stuff, and boil it down to the essential insights, really giving you that shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today, we're unraveling a complex puzzle, understanding China's defense spending. It's a number that's, well, it's talked about a lot, debated, and frankly, often shrouded in a bit of mystery.
Exactly. It's a topic just full of varying interpretations, different figures. It makes it one of the trickier areas in geopolitical analysis, honestly.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to cut through some of that noise, look at the different ways experts actually try to estimate these figures, and uncover what's really most important for you to grasp.
And we've pulled together quite a set of sources for this. We're looking at reports from big names like the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IDIS, and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, ISIPAIA.
Plus analyses from the U.S. Pentagon, academic papers, news reports too, right? Both Chinese and international media.
Absolutely. It's a broad spectrum.
Okay, should give us a good foundation. Hopefully you'll get a much clearer picture of what's really going on. So let's start with the basics. What does China officially say?
Okay, well, according to a Global Times report that's a state-affiliated outlet, from March 2025, they plan to spend about 1.67 trillion yuan, give or take. That translates to roughly US $234.5 billion for 2024.
And looking ahead to 2025.
Projection is around US $249 billion. Now, that represents a 7.2% increase from the previous year.
Okay, 7.2%. And they often highlight something about the growth rate, don't they?
They do. They consistently emphasize that their defense spending has kept to single-digit growth for 9 years straight. And importantly, they point out its share as a percentage of GDP has stayed under 1.5% for many years.
Which they say is lower than the global average.
Precisely. That's their public official stance. They frame this spending as the, quote, bare minimum needed.
Bare minimum for what, exactly?
To safeguard national sovereignty, security, development interests, and also to fulfill their international responsibilities, as they put it.
And they often compare this to the U.S., right?
Oh, frequently. They contrast it with the U.S. defense budget, which was around $825 billion for 2024, heading towards maybe $895 billion for 2025. And the U.S. consistently spends over 3% of its GDP on defense. So that comparison is a key part of their messaging.
Okay, so that bare minimum claim really hinges on that comparison, doesn't it?
Right.
But given these official numbers, they seem pretty clear. Why this skepticism? Why do so many outside observers feel these figures are, well, inconclusive or maybe even misleading?
Yeah, the big word here is opacity. The lack of transparency in the Chinese government's official reporting is just a major factor. There's a 2020 paper from ISIS that really highlights this longstanding belief that China's official budget just leaves out key categories of military-related spending.
And this isn't a new concern.
Not at all. This goes back to the late 1990s. Researchers like Wang Xiaoguang started pointing out back then that the official defense budget just didn't cover everything. It didn't include all the spending related to supporting the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, and especially its modernization efforts.
Okay, so the opacity is one thing, but let's unpack that. What specifically tends to get left out, historically speaking? And how do experts even start trying to estimate the real figure? Where do they look?
Well, those early methods like Wang's, they identified sort of two main buckets of extra spending. First, you had spending from budgets outside the Ministry of National Defense, things like defense R&D conducted by defense industry institutes.
Okay, so research happening elsewhere.
Right. Also, parts of the People's Armed Police, the PIP, budget, military construction projects, even compensation for soldiers leaving the service. That was one bucket. The second was off-budget sources entirely.
Off-budget, like what?
Things like commercial activities run by the PLA itself and profits they might make from selling arms internationally.
Huh. So the military running businesses.
It used to be more prevalent, yes. Now, institutions like SIPRI and ICE adopted versions of these methodologies to try and add these costs back in. Though ICE, for example, tended to be a bit more conservative, they decided to remove state subsidies to the defense industry from their estimates, for instance.
Okay, so different groups trying different ways to add things back.
Exactly. And then, just to make it even trickier, you've got the recent military reorganizations under President Xi. Like in 2018, when they integrated the China Coast Guard, the CCG, and the PPAP more directly under the Central Military Commission, the CMC.
How does that complicate things?
It just further blurs the lines. It makes it harder to track where the money associated with those forces is actually being accounted for if it's showing up in the defense budget at all.
Fascinating. So reforms aimed at perhaps centralizing control might actually maybe unintentionally, make the spending less transparent from the outside.
It can certainly seem that way.
All right, so that's the historical context. Beyond those known omissions, what new areas or maybe reevaluated categories do experts now think we need to factor in? Where else might China be tucking away costs related to its strategic goals? This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
It does. And what's striking isn't just that there are hidden costs, but how they reflect China's sort of holistic approach, blurring lines between military, civilian, commercial sectors. It's a different model than typical Western defense budgeting. The 2020 ICIS paper digs into this, proposing several categories, some pretty unique to China.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, interestingly, something like arms imports, which people used to think were off-budget research, now suggests they're probably included in the official PLA budget. So that's one thing clarified.
Okay, so imports are likely in. What's out?
Other areas need a much closer look. Let's maybe group them. First, think about strategic infrastructure and force projection costs. Take the China Coast Guard, the CCG. We mentioned it was integrated into the PP structure in 2018.
Wait.
But its spending didn't cause a big jump in the published PIP figures. That suggests its costs might still be handled separately, maybe extra budgetary. We know China spent something like close to US $8.7 billion on its Coast Guard between 2011 and 2015 alone. That's about $1.74 billion a year just for operations and building ships.
And the key point is, the CCG isn't just policing fisheries, is it?
Not at all. It performs definite military roles, especially in the East and South China Seas. It operates ships with military capabilities. It's effectively a second navy in some ways.
So a military arm funded potentially outside the main defense budget. That's significant. What about the island building? That was very visible.
Extremely visible. The island building program in the South China Sea, creating those artificial islands, especially in the Spratlys. By mid-2015, they'd created over 2,900 acres of new land features. Now, private companies did the dredging and construction.
And it wasn't a commercial project.
Definitely not. It was a state-directed strategic project. And the cost estimates are staggering. For Fiery Cross Reef, just one example, estimates were just under US $1 billion per acre for construction.
Per acre, wow.
Yeah. The total for just 3 of the main reefs, Fiery Cross, Mischief, and Subi, was estimated around US $4.74 billion over 5 years. A massive infrastructure cost with clear military implications.
Okay, so infrastructure. What about big-ticket weapons systems,
Yeah.
like aircraft carriers?
Good question. That falls under major procurement costs. There have been reports suggesting the costs for carriers like the Liaoning estimated maybe RMB 26 billion or about 4 billion US dollars, and the Shandong maybe RMB 25 billion might not be fully captured in the official defense budget.
How would they hide that?
Well, experts look at something called the net defense revenue of China's big state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, that are involved in defense manufacturing. Between 2015 and 2017, this figure was hovering around US $30 billion a year.
Net revenue, so profits, essentially.
Kind of. It's complex accounting, but the idea is this net revenue might represent special funding pools for major weapons buys that aren't explicitly listed in the Defense Ministry's budget.
Sounds like a potential slush fund, almost.
Mm.
Are there other, maybe less obvious areas? Like tech development?
Absolutely. That's a huge one. We need to consider dual-use R&D and other unaccounted funds. China has this strategy called military-civil fusion.
Right, we hear that term a lot.
Right.
What does it mean in practice for spending?
It means actively using the domestic science and tech base, including private companies for military advancement. Think AI, robotics, quantum computing. For instance, China reportedly spent US $12 billion on AI systems back in 2017, put $1 billion into a national lab for quantum information sciences.
But that's overall R&D spending, not necessarily military, right?
Exactly. Market value isn't direct government defense spending, but it shows the massive pool of resources the PLA can tap into. This leads to what some call the black hole method.
The black hole method sounds ominous.
It just describes the gap researchers find between the central government's total R&D spending and some of all the budgets disclosed by specific agencies. For example, back in 2011, over half of the central government's science and tech spending was unaccounted for in agency budgets. The assumption is a big chunk likely went to secret defense-related R&D.
Wow, half. That's a potential black hole, all right. Okay, what else?
Finally, let's touch on personnel and related costs. We mentioned the People's Armed Police, the PP. While central government PP spending often gets included in estimates now, spending by local provincial governments on PP units often wasn't.
Local spending matters.
It can add up. ICE research managed managed to estimate provincial PP spending figures like RMB 405 billion, maybe around 60 billion US dollars back in 2014, so that needs to be factored in. And the PP's role has grown to internal security, maritime security, even supporting the PLA in wartime.
Got it. Any other smaller bits?
Well, things like military parades, those big impressive events. The 70th anniversary parade in 2019, estimated cost around US $40 million. Probably not in the main budget, though, hard to confirm. And Veterans Affairs. After some protests about pensions, China set up a dedicated ministry in 2018. Its central budget was small initially, maybe US $86 million in 2019, but provincial budgets added another US $1.6 billion or so.
Right, that's a really comprehensive list. Coast Guard, island building, hidden R&D, local forces, veterans. It paints a much broader picture. But it also raises that comparison issue again. If these categories are kind of unique to how China structures things, does it make comparing their spending to, say, the U.S. almost impossible?
It definitely raises that important query about consistency. Like you mentioned, Veterans Affairs. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs had a budget request for fiscal year 2020 of U.S. $220 billion.
Whoa, $220 billion.
Right, but that's not typically counted as part of the U.S. defense budget in standard international comparisons. So it really underlines the challenge. You have to define what exactly constitutes defense spending if you want to make fair cross-country comparisons. You need apples to apples, not apples to oranges, plus veterans and Coast Guards.
Absolutely. That definition is key.
Yeah.
Okay, so beyond what gets counted, there's this other massive challenge. How do you actually convert China's spending in yuan into U.S. dollars? We hear these terms thrown around: market exchange rates, UR, and purchasing power parity, PPP. What's the difference fundamentally, and why does it cause such huge swings in the estimates?
Yes, the conversion conundrum. It's critical, and honestly, it's where a lot of estimates can really go off the rails. So a market exchange rate, MIR, is just the standard rate you see on currency markets. Using MIR tends to minimize the actual level of economic resources China allocates to defense.
Minimize.
Because in countries where labor, food, housing, basic services are cheaper domestically, like China compared to the U.S., a dollar exchanged at the market rate doesn't reflect how much stuff that money can actually buy locally. PPP, purchasing power parity, tries to correct for this. It attempts to figure out how many yuan you'd need to buy the same basket of goods and services in China that you could buy with $1 US in the U.S.
Okay, so PPP tries to adjust for those local cost differences, which means generally using PPP would make China's defense budget look larger in dollar terms, right?
Generally, yes, that's the tendency. But, and this is but it's far from straightforward. There's a really insightful paper from the Texas National Security Review, TNSR, from June 2024 that dives deep into how PPP can be seriously misapplied.
Misapplied how?
Well, they argue some analysts make a crucial mistake. They use a single economy-wide PPP exchange rate and apply it to China's entire defense budget.
And why is that a problem?
Because defense budgets are a mix. You've got labor-intensive parts salaries, basic operations where China does have a significant cost advantage due to lower wages. PPP makes sense there. But then you have capital and technology-intensive parts, advanced fighter jets, missiles, sophisticated sensors. For those, the cost might be much closer to global market prices, or even higher if they rely on imports or difficult indigenous development. Applying an economy-wide PPP inflates the value of everything, even the high-tech stuff where China might not have a cost advantage at all.
Oh, I see. So applying a general PPP across the board exaggerates the purchasing power, especially for advanced military hardware.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So the takeaway isn't just PPP big, MER small. It's that how you apply PPP is critical. You can't just slap one number on the whole budget. How exactly do some estimates get this wrong, according to the TNSR paper? And what's their suggestion for getting it, well, more right?
Right. The TNSR paper points out 4 main pitfalls analysts fall into. First, they sometimes focus too much on the least lethal capabilities. They overemphasize those wage differences, making China's spending seem huge because personnel are cheap, while kind of downplaying the fact that modern military punch often comes from expensive high-tech systems, not just boots on the ground.
So focusing on numbers of soldiers rather than the cost of advanced jets, for example.
Kind of, yes. Second, relatedly, they sometimes use exaggerated wage advantages. Yes, Chinese military wages are lower, but maybe not as much lower as some generic PPP rates suggest. For example, they calculate a U.S. Army sergeant might earn about $2,730 a month. A comparable Chinese rank, as Zhongxi, earns around 7,300 yuan. At the
Right.
2024 MER, that's about 1,014 US dollars.
Okay, so lower, but maybe closer to a 2.7 to 1 ratio in yuan per dollar terms for military labor specifically.
Exactly. That suggests a specific military labor PPP of maybe 2.7 yuan per dollar. That's quite different, maybe less than half, of some higher general economy-wide PPP estimates people sometimes use.
Okay, so overstating the wage gap is another issue. What else?
Third, inconsistent PPP application. This is key. Some studies might correctly use a sector-specific PPP for personnel costs, which makes sense. But then they turn around and use a general GDP PPP for everything else in the budget, including advanced weapons procurement.
And that's misleading because
Because for some high-tech gear, China might actually face a cost disadvantage. The TNSR paper points out, for instance, the PPP for machinery and equipment in 2017 was 9.3 yuan per dollar. That's actually worse purchasing power than the market exchange rate at the time, which was about 6.8 yuan per dollar.
wow, so using a general PPP there would make it seem like they're getting more high-tech equipment for their money when the reality might be the opposite.
Precisely, because a lot of their advanced manufacturing might rely on expensive imported components or very costly homegrown R&D to catch up.
Fascinating. Okay, and the fourth pitfall.
This goes back to our earlier point. Failing to compare apples to apples by cherry-picking those off-budget items. Some estimates will correctly add in China's PP and Coast Guard spending to the defense total. But then, when comparing to the U.S., they don't add in analogous U.S. entities.
Like the U.S. Coast Guard, which is under Homeland Security, not the Department of Defense.
Exactly. Or the massive Department of Veterans Affairs budget we talked about.
Yeah.
If you're going to broaden the definition of defense-related spending for China, you have to do it consistently for the country you're comparing it to. Otherwise, the comparison is skewed from the start.
That seems like a fundamental rule of comparison, doesn't it? Treat both sides the same way. So, given all these potential mistakes, what's the TNSR paper's proposed solution? How do they try to build a more accurate picture?
They propose a really interesting novel method. First, they try to compare genuinely similar budget categories for both countries. So for the U.S., they look at the core DoD budget, but also relevant parts of the VA budget and elements from the Department of Homeland Security, like the Coast Guard. They build a comparable U.S. baseline.
Okay, so making the U.S. side more comprehensive first.
Yes. Then, for China's spending both official and estimated off-budget items, they apply different tailored PPP conversion factors for different categories. They use one PPP factor specifically for personnel costs, another for operations and training, and yet another for equipment procurement, trying to reflect those varying cost advantages or disadvantages we discussed.
So a much more granular approach to PPP, not one size fits all.
Exactly. And using this more nuanced method, what do they find? They estimate China's total 2024 defense spending, including those off-budget bits, and using the adjusted PPPs, comes out to around US $471 billion.
$471 billion. Okay, so that's definitely much higher than the official $235 billion figure.
Significantly higher, yes. It acknowledges the hidden costs and the purchasing power for personnel, but it's also way below some of those really high-end claims you sometimes hear, like US $700 billion or even more.
Right, and how does that $471 billion compare to the U.S. total, using their comparable methodology?
When they compare it to their adjusted U.S. figure, which they estimate is somewhere between US $1.2 trillion and US $1.3 trillion for comparable defense-related activities, China's spending works out to about 36 to 38% of the U.S. total.
Okay, 36 to 38%. Still a very large amount, number 2 in the world by a huge margin, but puts the scale relative to the U.S. into a different perspective than some other estimates might suggest.
Precisely. It provides important context. It acknowledges China's significant investment without resorting to potentially flawed methodologies that might overinflate the figures.
That's incredibly helpful for getting a handle on the numbers.
Okay.
So we've navigated the official figures, the hidden costs, the tricky world of currency conversion. Let's step back now. Big picture time. What does all this analysis, from the official lowball numbers to these more refined higher estimates, really tell us about China's military modernization journey and its impact globally?
Well, if you connect all these dots, the overwhelming picture is one of undeniable and critically consistent military modernization by China. Look at CPRI's 2025 report. They estimate China spent around US $314 billion in 2024 using their methodology. They note this was the largest year-on-year percentage increase since 2015 and marked the 30th consecutive year of growth in Chinese military spending.
30 years of continuous growth. That's a remarkable consistency.
It really is. And the Pentagon's own report from December 2024 estimates China's actual defense budget is likely 1.5 to 2 times its publicly stated figure. That puts their range somewhere between US $330 billion and US $450 billion, broadly aligning with the TNSR estimate we just discussed.
And where is this money going? What capabilities are they focusing on?
Across the board, really, but some areas stand out. They continue to rapidly expand and modernize their nuclear forces. The Pentagon estimates they had over 600 operational nuclear warheads in 2024.
Up from previous estimates.
Yes, and projected to potentially exceed 1,000 by 2030. They're also developing new, more survivable intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and those hypersonic glide vehicles we hear about.
So strategic forces are a priority. But it's not just nukes, is it? They seem to be building a comprehensive, modern military.
Absolutely. Take the PLA Navy, the plan. Numerically, it's now the largest navy in the world. About 370 ships and submarines currently.
Projected to grow.
Projected to reach 435 ships by 2030. And crucially, China's defense industrial base, particularly for shipbuilding, is described by the Pentagon as world-class and nearly self-sufficient. They can build almost everything they need themselves.
That's a major strategic advantage, self-sufficiency. What about air power and reach?
The PLA Air Force, the PLAAF, is heavily focused on building long-range precision strike capabilities. And beyond just hardware, China is actively seeking overseas logistics hubs and basing infrastructure.
Where are they looking?
The list is long. Reports mention countries from Burma and Cambodia to Pakistan, Sri Lanka, UAE, Kenya, Equatorial Guinea, even potentially Cuba. The goal is clearly to project military power far beyond China's immediate neighborhood.
Okay, so this sustained, strategically focused growth. Why should this matter specifically to you, our listener? What's the tangible impact of these climbing numbers?
Well, think about China's consistent economic growth over the past few decades. Even allocating what seems like a relatively small percentage of that massive GDP to defense translates into enormous resources in absolute terms. The Observer Research Foundation, ORF, pointed this out clearly. China's GDP grew something like 76% between 2015 and 2025. And guess what? Its official defense budget grew almost in lockstep by 72%.
So defense spending is keeping pace with overall economic growth.
Exactly. And looking forward, the Lowy Institute forecasts China's military expenditure could reach US $544 billion by 2035, still second to the US, which they project at over US $1.1 trillion, but a huge number nonetheless. This sustained long-term investment gives the PLA the resources and capability to significantly expand its influence, especially across the Indo-Pacific, but potentially globally too. It has the potential to really shift regional power balances and affect global stability. It's a fundamental change unfolding.
It certainly sounds like a formidable trajectory. Despite this massive sustained investment and growing capability, are there any signs of weaknesses, challenges, or potential breaks on China's military modernization?
Yes, the Pentagon report does highlight a couple of potential issues. One is corruption. It apparently remains endemic within the PLA system. We've seen reports of high-ranking officers, even defense industry executives, being investigated or removed as part of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaigns.
So corruption could be siphoning off resources or causing disruption.
It could. While it also reflects Xi's drive to professionalize the military and enforce loyalty, these purges might disrupt progress on key modernization goals, cause delays, or create uncertainty. Another point the Pentagon raises is operational experience, particularly for complex, large-scale operations.
Like what kind of operations?
Well, things like sophisticated urban warfare, or the kind of long-distance power projection and logistics that would be needed for major contingencies. The elephant in the room often being potential operations regarding Taiwan. The PLA has modernized rapidly, but it hasn't really demonstrated these capabilities at scale in a real-world contested environment. That kind of experience is hard to gain outside of actual conflict.
Interesting points. So potential internal issues like corruption and the gap in large-scale operational experience might be limiting factors, even with all the spending.
It could be, yes. They're factors to watch.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. It's absolutely clear that figuring out China's defense spending is way more complicated than just looking at the number Beijing puts out. While their official figures show, moderate growth, low GDP percentage, digging into the off-budget stuff, the R&D, the PPP conversion issues, it reveals a much, much larger military investment.
Indeed. I think the consensus across multiple credible sources, ICCPR, Pentagon, academic researchers like those at TNSR, is that China spends significantly more than its official budget suggests. Maybe 1.5 to 2 times more once you account for those hidden or differently categorized costs. But crucially, it's also vital we don't fall for flawed methods that wildly exaggerate the figures. Proper, careful analysis suggests China's total spending, while huge and growing, is still substantially less than that of the United States when you compare genuinely similar categories. Getting the methodology right matters.
It absolutely does. It's a dynamic picture, constantly evolving, and one that definitely challenges easy assumptions. So here's something for you, our listener, to maybe mull over or explore on your own after this. What does it truly mean for global stability, and maybe even for future technological innovation, when a nation's military budget becomes so deeply intertwined with its overall economic development, especially with its high-tech civilian industries, even private sector R&D? Think about how this concept of military-civil fusion in practice might really reshape the global landscape economically, technologically, strategically in the years to come.